What's up, guys? Welcome to the third edition of my vlog, where today we're going to be talking about Chapter 37, New Conflagrations, World War II. So before I begin, I just want to mention three things. The first one is you may notice green highlighting now, and that represents the vocabulary words that were given to us, and those will be gone over in detail. The second thing is you can find this PDF and many other ones in the Google Drive link description below. And the third thing is if you have any comments or critiques, feel free to send them in the comment section below or DM me, and I'll try to use those to make this vlog better. So let's begin. It begins with the origins of World War II, which basically starts when Japan decides to start inching in on China, and the Japanese started by invading Manchuria, which is northern China. As you may remember, Japan was part of the League of Nations, and the League of Nations didn't like this, so Japan simply withdrew. Once they withdrew, they decided to go deeper in, and that began with the rape of Nanjing. Nanjing is actually a city in China, and they started there. They aerial bombed many surrounding cities, and there was widespread rape and slaughter. To counter this, China had their nationalists and communist forces who decided to temporarily stop their civil war in order to counter the Japanese. And while they weren't able to expel the Japanese, they were able to severely stop the Japanese from extending in on their land. Japan at this time had a triple pact with Germany and Italy, and together these three would go on to become the Axis powers. Italy was in a similar place. As you may remember, they were part of the Allies in World War I, and after the Paris Peace Conference didn't give them much land or new resources, they got kind of angry, and a fascist dictator named Mussolini rose up and promised new glory for Italy. And to do this, they annexed Libya and invaded Ethiopia, which are both northern African countries. Germany was even more similar to Italy, and as you may remember, at the Paris Peace Treaty of Versailles, they had to give up the most economic benefits, and they had to pay the most reparations, and basically they took all the blame for the First World War. And many Germans were unhappy, so they looked to a fascist dictator named Hitler. And Hitler blamed Jews, communists, liberals, and lots of other people for losing the war and the horrible treaty that was signed afterward. And Hitler wanted to regain German pride, so to do this, he decided to rebuild his military and start taking land. He took a bunch of land like the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and France and Britain didn't stop him. But eventually, they got kind of uneasy, and so Hitler decided to have the Munich Conference, which they said, hey, we won't go into any more lands, but you guys should let us have this land, which is Sudetenland. And so Britain and France agreed because they really didn't want a second world war. And so right after, Hitler also took Czechoslovakia, which was illegal, but Britain and France didn't want war. And finally, the biggest thing before World War II was Russians and the Germans signed a treaty of non-aggression, basically saying Hitler would not go in and invade Russia. The German strategy was blitzkrieg, which was lightning war, basically surprise attacks. And to test this out, they invaded Poland in September 1939, which they were not allowed to do. And as a result, France and Britain didn't like it, and they decided to go to war with Germany. And at first, the Germans had their U-boat submarines, and they were able to win a lot of battles and take a lot of land. And they took most of Europe, all the way to France. And once they got to France, they focused their sight on Britain, which they decided to go by air attacks. And through air attacks, they gained a lot of broken London cities and places in Britain, but they were still stuck and they couldn't really invade the Britain Island. And so they turned their direction also to the other end, which was the Soviet Union. And this was called Operation Barbarossa. And this violated the previous pact they had made with the Russians. And at first, Germans, once again, they got a lot of land early on, but the Russian winter caught up to the German troops and eventually it stalled them, just like it had stalled Napoleon many hundred years earlier. In Japan, over in the Pacific, they also gained a lot of islands, and they decided to focus their sights on many American possessions next. And so the first time they attacked was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And this was a horrible defeat for the U.S. Navy, and they suffered a lot. And right after, the U.S. officially entered the war against the Japanese, and so that also meant the Germans and Italians decided to go into the war against the U.S. Well, right before, the U.S. had been sending military supplies over to Britain, but now they were officially in the war, and basically the whole U.S. economy was diverted to go fight this war. When the U.S. came, they lost a lot of land at first, but eventually they turned it around, and they were able to gain a lot of Japanese possessions and help turn the tide around also in Europe. And in Europe, the defeats happened first for the British, not the British, the Germans, and eventually Hitler committed suicide when the German troops were losing. Once Germany left the war, Italy left the war as well, and the fighting in Europe was basically over. But in Asia, the Japanese were still really wanting to fight, and there were many more battles that occurred, such as Midway, when the U.S. broke Japanese code and actually started gaining more islands. And near the end of the war, the Japanese used kamikaze pilots as a last-ditch resort, and it didn't really work out. On Okinawa, civilians refused to surrender, and many of them died. And so the U.S. had a final option, and that was to go actually invade Japan. But that would have costed a lot of lives and a lot of money, so they decided to use the new technology on 2 Japanese cities, and that was the atomic bomb in August 1945. Once that wiped out the 2 Japanese cities, the Japanese finally decided to surrender, and the U.S. and all the other allied countries won the war. Throughout the war, lots of bad things happened. One of the biggest is the Holocaust, and we learned about this in middle school and elementary school as well. But this was basically the Germans really disliked especially the Jewish people in their country, and they wanted to exterminate all of them. To do this, they had the final solution, which many Jews and other quote-unquote undesirables were killed. And they killed lots of Jews, up to 6 million experts believe. And this was a really sad moment in history. And many Jews resisted, but it didn't really work out, and the Germans killed a lot of people in the process. Over in Asia, a similar thing happened. Many Japanese armies force women, such as in Korea especially, to become comfort women, and these were basically just women forced to become prostitutes to the many Japanese soldiers. And this was really bad because many women were raped, and they were forced against their will to do things they did not want to do just because of war. After the war, there were 2 post-war settlements established, and it was Yalta in February 1945 and Potsdam, and that was the same year, July through August. And basically, the Allied forces decided to split up the lands they had conquered, but also the Russians, they decided, which became the Soviet Union by now, they wanted lots more land. So there was this sort of break in the Allied powers. In Germany especially, the Soviets took all of East Germany, while the US, Britain, and France split out West Germany. And right after this, the so-called Iron Curtain occurred. And then in this Iron Curtain, basically the Soviets put up a wall to the west, and there was this big division, and this would eventually lead to what's known as the Cold War. And this happened in many areas around all around the world where previous Axis powers had their lands. And another part of post-war was the Truman Doctrine, when the U.S. would support free peoples resisting subjugation. Basically, the U.S. said if any people were against communism, but communism was rising in their country, the U.S. would come in to their aid to try to kick out the communists. And at the same time, the Soviets were promoting communism, So it was kind of the opposing force to the Truman Doctrine. And this is why they wanted to contain communism, because the U.S. is a democratic country with democratic ideals. And there were also global reconstruction plans. One that came out of the U.S. was the Marshall Plan, and this was aimed specifically at Europe. They wanted to rebuild all the bombed out cities and infrastructure in Europe. Also, new alliances formed, and two of the big ones were NATO and the Warsaw Pact. NATO was created by the U.S., and it was a lot of countries against Soviet military aggression because, as you know, the Soviets were trying to gain more land. And to counter this, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact. And still to today, NATO exists. But out of these pacts, two global superpowers arose, and that was the United States and the Soviet Union. So you could say that was an effect of World War II. Global superpowers rose up, especially the US and the Soviet Union, and they were superpowers because they had the most advanced technology and the most influence in the world, especially with their nuclear programs. And eventually this would lead to the Cold War, which will be discussed later. And to counter all these alliances, again, the United Nations formed, which was trying to have international peace and security. Even today, the United Nations exists, and it's just a platform for countries to maybe talk out their problems instead of resorting to last-ditch military efforts to prevent a World War III. So, in recap, that's basically Chapter 37, New Conflagrations, World War II, and those were the big main points of this chapter. Thanks for joining me, and hope to see you next time.